What happens when a wedding meant to secure a future turns into a public collapse in a single minute? How did one sentence from the bride's mother cost her daughter everything she thought was guaranteed? They believed I would stay quiet and pay. Instead, I stood up, spoke to my son, and ended the wedding in front of everyone. My name is Zane Braskin, and I own 3 successful auto repair shops in suburban Chicago. At 52, I've learned that silence is often mistaken for weakness until it isn't. I've also learned that respect cannot be demanded after it is lost. But I'm getting ahead of myself. It started 6 months before my son Selias' wedding, at what Torren called a casual pre-wedding dinner. Nothing about Romano's Steakhouse screamed casual to me, with its white tablecloths and $40 entrees, but I kept that observation to myself as I walked through the mahogany doors that Tuesday evening. Kana had already claimed the head of the table when I arrived, her perfectly manicured fingers wrapped around a glass of wine that probably cost more than my dinner. She was 54, with the kind of aggressive blonde highlights that announced money spent on maintenance rather than earned through work. Her daughter Leora sat to her right, nervously adjusting her designer bracelet. Another expense I was beginning to suspect hadn't come from her lifestyle blog about affordable luxury. "Zane," Keena's voice carried across the restaurant with the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "So wonderful you could make time for us. I know how busy you must be with your little garage business." Little garage business. I employed 23 people across 3 locations and had been in business for 18 years. But I simply nodded and took my seat across from my son, Selias. He gave me a look that I'd learned to read over 27 years of fatherhood, the look that said, "Please don't start anything tonight." "Thank you for organizing this, Mrs. Torren," I replied, unfolding my napkin. "It's important that our families get to know each other better." Keena smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, please, call me Kana. After all, we're going to be family soon. Well, in a manner of speaking." The waiter approached, and Kana immediately launched into a detailed critique of the wine list, finally settling on a bottle that cost more than most people spent on groceries in a week. She ordered for the table without asking anyone's preferences, explaining to the clearly uncomfortable waiter that she knew what was best for everyone. As we waited for our appetizers, Kana leaned back in her chair and surveyed the table like a general reviewing troops. "So Zane, Leora tells me you've been very generous with the wedding planning. That's exactly what I hoped to hear." I hadn't been generous so much as uninformed about the mounting costs, but I kept that thought to myself. Selias and Leora's happiness is what matters most to me. "Oh, absolutely," Kana agreed, though her tone suggested she found the sentiment quaint. "Though, of course, happiness is so much easier to achieve when there's financial security involved. Don't you think?" Leora shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Mom, maybe we should talk about something else." "Nonsense, dear. Money matters are family matters now." Keena turned back to me with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. "I've been thinking about the reception venue. The country club Leora originally chose is lovely, but it's not really going to make the right impression. I found a much better option, the Fairmont Grand Ballroom downtown. It's only 3 times the cost, but the photos will be absolutely stunning for Leora's social media presence." I felt Selias tense beside me. We'd already put down a non-refundable deposit at the country club, money that would be lost if we switched venues. "I wasn't aware the original venue was insufficient," I said carefully. Kana waved her hand dismissively. "Oh, it's fine for some people, I suppose. But Leora has a brand to maintain. Her followers expect a certain level of sophistication. You understand." The appetizers arrived, providing a momentary reprieve from the conversation. I watched Kana cut into her shrimp cocktail with the precision of a surgeon, each movement calculated and deliberate. This wasn't a casual dinner, it was a negotiation, and I was beginning to understand that I was expected to be the losing party. "The flowers are another concern," Kana continued between bites. "The florist Leora chose initially has a very suburban aesthetic. I found someone who worked on the Morrison wedding last spring. You know, the pharmaceutical family. Their work is much more suitable for the kind of celebration we're planning." "We're planning?" I asked, setting down my fork. Keena's smile sharpened. "Well, naturally. I have experience with these things. Leora's first wedding was beautiful, though of course much smaller in scope." First wedding. This was news to me. I glanced at Selias, who was staring intently at his salad as if it held the secrets of the universe. "I wasn't aware Leora had been married before." "Oh, it barely counts," Keena said with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "She was so young, and he was completely unsuitable. No ambition, no resources, nothing like Selias, of course. This time she's chosen much more wisely." The way she said chosen made it clear that she viewed the selection process as primarily financial. I felt something cold settle in my stomach as I began to understand the true nature of this dinner. Selias tells me your business has been doing very well, Kena continued, apparently oblivious to the tension building around the table. 3 locations now? That's impressive for someone who started with just one little shop. I've been fortunate, I replied, though fortune had little to do with the 18-hour days and 7-day weeks I'd worked to build my business from nothing. And I'm sure you want to ensure that success continues into the next generation, Kena said, her meaning unmistakable. A good marriage can be such an asset to a man's career, the right connections, the right social circles. Leora has so many influential friends through her blog. I looked across the table at Leora, who seemed to be shrinking into her chair with each word her mother spoke. She was 26 years old, beautiful in the way that required constant maintenance, and clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation, but she wasn't stopping it. What exactly are you suggesting, Kena? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Kena's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of someone about to close a deal. Well, I've been thinking about the young couple's future. They'll need a proper home, of course, something in a good neighborhood that reflects their status. And Leora's blog is really taking off, but it needs investment to reach the next level. With the right backing, she could become a real influencer. The return on investment could be substantial. The main courses arrived, but my appetite had vanished. I was beginning to see the evening for what it really was, not a family dinner, but a business proposition. And I was the mark. I appreciate your enthusiasm for their future, I said slowly, but I think Selias and Leora should be the ones making decisions about their lives. Kena's fork paused halfway to her mouth. Oh, of course. But sometimes young people need guidance from those with more experience, more resources. More resources, I repeated. You mean money. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the ambient restaurant noise seemed to fade as Kena processed my directness. When she spoke again, her voice had lost its warm veneer. I mean practical support, she said carefully. The kind that comes from family who want to see their children succeed. I glanced at Selias again. He was 27 years old, held a degree in mechanical engineering, and had been working at my shop since he was 16. He was responsible, hard-working, and capable of supporting himself and a wife without any help from me. But looking at him now, I could see the weight of expectation pressing down on his shoulders like a physical force. Selias, I said quietly, what do you think about all this? He looked up, startled to be directly addressed after sitting silently through most of the meal. I just want Leora to be happy, Dad. Whatever that takes. Whatever that takes, Kena echoed with satisfaction. Exactly. And happiness, as I said, is so much easier with the right foundation. I set my napkin on the table and leaned back in my chair, studying the woman across from me. In 18 years of business, I'd encountered my share of people who viewed relationships as transactions, but I'd never seen someone apply that philosophy to their own daughter's marriage with such naked calculation. I think I understand now, I said finally. This isn't about Selias and Leora's happiness. This is about what I can provide for your family. Kena's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and predatory underneath. I think you're misunderstanding the situation, Zane. This is about family, about doing what's best for everyone involved. Everyone involved, I repeated. And what exactly are you contributing to this arrangement? The question hung in the air like smoke. Kena's mouth opened and closed once before she found her voice. I'm contributing my daughter, obviously, and my experience, my connections. Your connections, I said. The same connections that couldn't prevent Leora's first marriage from failing? Leora made a small sound of distress, but Kena's eyes flashed with anger. That was completely different. She was young and foolish. She's learned from that mistake. What mistake was that exactly? Marrying for love instead of money? The words were out before I could stop them, and the effect was immediate. Kena's face flushed red, Leora looked like she wanted to disappear, and Selias stared at me with wide eyes. But I was past the point of polite conversation. I think, Kena said, her voice tight with barely controlled fury, that you're being deliberately difficult. This is supposed to be a celebration of our children's love. Then let's celebrate that, I agreed. Let's talk about what they bring to each other, not what I'm expected to bring to you. The rest of the dinner passed in strained silence, punctuated only by Kena's occasional passive-aggressive comments about family obligations and supporting the next generation. When the check arrived, she made a show of reaching for her purse before allowing me to pay, as if her gesture of offering was equivalent to actual contribution. As we stood to leave, Kana placed her hand on my arm with the familiarity of someone who assumed intimacy where none existed. Zane, I hope you'll think about what we discussed tonight. Family is so important, don't you think? I looked down at her manicured fingers on my sleeve, then back at her face. Yes, Kina. Family is important. That's exactly why I'll be thinking very carefully about everything that was said tonight. Something in my tone must have registered because her smile faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly, air-kissing my cheek before sweeping toward the exit with Leora trailing behind her like a reluctant shadow. Selias and I walked to our cars in silence. As I reached for my door handle, he finally spoke. Dad, I'm sorry about tonight. I know she can be intense. I turned to face my son, this young man I'd raised to be honest and hardworking and decent. Selias, do you love Leora? Of course I do. And does she love you? He hesitated for just a moment too long. I think so. I mean, yes. Yes, she does. Then that should be enough, I said. Love should be enough. As I drove home through the quiet suburban streets, Kina's words echoed in my mind. He thinks this is love. She hadn't said it that night, but I could hear it in every calculation she'd made, every expectation she'd laid out. And I began to wonder if she was right, if my son really did think this was love, or if he'd simply been convinced that love required a price tag. What I didn't know yet was that the real bill was still coming due. The call came 3 days after the dinner, at 6 a.m. while I was reviewing invoices in my home office. Selias's voice was tight with stress, the way it used to sound when he was 12 and had broken something valuable. Dad, I need to ask you something, and I need you to not get angry. I set down my coffee and gave him my full attention. What's going on, son? Leora's having some cash flow issues with her business. It's temporary. She's got several brand partnerships coming through next month, but she needs to cover some expenses now. I was wondering if you could spot me about $3,000. I'll pay you back as soon as her checks come in. $3,000. Not an amount that would break me, but not pocket change either. What kind of expenses are we talking about? Photography equipment, mainly. She needs to upgrade her camera setup to meet the requirements for these new contracts. It's an investment that'll pay for itself within a few weeks. I leaned back in my chair, remembering Kana's comments about Leora's brand and the need for investment. Selias, how many times have you helped Leora with her business expenses? The silence on the other end of the line told me everything I needed to know. It's not like that, Dad. She's building something real. The blog is growing, and these partnerships are legitimate. She just needs to bridge the gap until the money starts flowing consistently. How much have you already given her? Another pause. It's not about the money, it's about supporting each other. That's what couples do. That's not what I asked. I heard him take a deep breath. Maybe 8,000 or 9,000 total. But like I said, it's temporary. Once the blog takes off, $8,000 or $9,000. I felt that cold sensation in my stomach again, the same one I'd experienced at dinner. Selias, how long have you two been together? 14 months. 14 months, and he'd already given her nearly $10,000. I did quick math in my head. That was more than $700 a month, every month since they'd started dating. For a woman whose lifestyle blog was supposedly generating income. Dad, are you still there? I'm here. Can you come by the house tonight? I think we need to talk. You're not going to lecture me about Leora, are you? Because I really don't need that right now. The defensive edge in his voice told me that someone else had already been filling his head with justifications. I'm not going to lecture you. I just want to understand the situation better. He arrived at 7:30, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. I'd made dinner, nothing fancy, just grilled chicken and vegetables, and we ate in the kitchen where I'd helped him with homework for 12 years. Some conversations require familiar ground. Tell me about Leora's business, I said, once we'd finished eating. How exactly does this blog generate income? Selias brightened slightly, clearly more comfortable discussing his fiancé's work than her financial needs. She partners with brands to showcase their products. Clothing, makeup, home goods, that kind of thing. Companies pay her to feature their stuff in her posts because she has a really engaged audience. How big is her audience? About 15,000 followers on Instagram, maybe 8,000 on her blog? I nodded thoughtfully. I didn't know much about social media marketing, but I knew enough about business to understand that numbers mattered. And the companies pay her based on those follower counts? Partly. It's also about engagement rates and demographics. Her followers are mostly women between 25 and 40 with disposable income. That's a valuable demographic for brands. I'm sure it is. So how much does she typically earn per partnership? Selias shifted in his chair. It varies. Anywhere from a few hundred to maybe 2,000 for a really big campaign. How often does she land these partnerships? Well, that's the thing. The market is really competitive right now. A lot of influencers are fighting for the same contracts. But Leora's working with an agency now that specializes in placing lifestyle bloggers with major brands. They're confident they can get her more consistent work. An agency. I felt my internal warning system activate. What kind of agency? It's called Elevated Influence. They represent some really successful people, but they require their clients to maintain a certain image standard. That's why Leora needs the camera equipment, and why the wedding has to be at the right venue with the right photographer. It's all part of building her brand. The pieces were starting to fit together in a picture I didn't like. Selias, has Leora ever shown you her actual earnings from these partnerships? What do you mean? I mean contracts, payment records, tax documents, proof of how much money is actually coming in versus how much is going out. His defensive posture returned immediately. Dad, I'm not her accountant. I trust her. That's what people do in relationships. They trust each other. Trust is important, I agreed. But so is transparency, especially when it comes to money. Especially when you're planning to get married. Are you saying you think she's lying to me? I chose my words carefully. I'm saying that any business requires documentation. If she's asking you to invest in her success, you have the right to see evidence that the investment is sound. It's not an investment, it's support. There's a difference. Is there? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've been funding her lifestyle for over a year while she chases a business model that may or may not be profitable. Selias stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the kitchen floor. I knew this would happen. I knew you'd find a way to make this about money instead of love. Selias, sit down. Something in my tone must have reached him, because he sat. I leaned forward, making sure he could see my face clearly. I love you more than anything in this world, I said quietly. I want you to be happy. But happiness built on financial deception doesn't last, and what you're describing sounds less like a partnership and more like a one-way flow of resources. You don't know Leora like I do. You're right, I don't. But I know you. I know you're generous and loyal and willing to sacrifice for the people you care about. Those are wonderful qualities, but they can also make you vulnerable to people who might take advantage of your good nature. Leora's not taking advantage of me. Then prove it. Ask to see her business records. Ask for a detailed plan showing how these investments will generate returns. Ask for a timeline when she'll be able to contribute equally to your shared expenses. I can't do that. It would show that I don't trust her. No, it would show that you're a responsible adult who understands that marriage is a partnership, not a charity. We sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, Selias spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. What if you're wrong about her? Then I'll apologize and welcome her into our family with open arms. And what if you're right? I reached across the table and squeezed his shoulder. Then we'll deal with that too. But either way, you deserve to know the truth before you commit your life to someone. He left without asking for the $3,000, which told me that some part of him was already beginning to question the narrative he'd been accepting. But I knew that doubt alone wouldn't be enough. People in Selias' position needed to see the truth for themselves in their own time. What I didn't anticipate was how quickly that time would come, or how ugly the revelation would be. The pattern became clear over the next 2 weeks. Selias would call with another temporary financial need. Wedding photographer deposits, dress alterations, venue upgrades that Kana had insisted were absolutely necessary. Each request was presented as a one-time expense, a small investment in their future happiness. But I was keeping track. In 14 days, the requests totaled nearly $6,000. And each time I asked for details or documentation, Selias became defensive and evasive. Dad, you're making this way more complicated than it needs to be. Couples help each other. That's normal. Helping each other is normal, I agreed. But this isn't mutual help. This is you funding someone else's lifestyle while getting nothing in return except promises. I'm getting a wife. I'm getting a partner. Are you? Because from what I can see, you're getting someone who views you as a financial resource, not a life partner. The conversation always ended the same way, with Selias hanging up in frustration and me staring at my phone, wondering how to protect my son from a mistake that could cost him far more than money. The answer came from an unexpected source, Kana herself. The meeting with the wedding planner was supposed to be routine, final headcount, menu selections, timeline confirmations. I attended because Selias had asked me to, and because I was beginning to understand that my presence at these events was less about input and more about implied financial backing. Elegant events occupied a converted Victorian house in downtown Naperville, all exposed brick and carefully curated vintage furniture designed to suggest both sophistication and warmth. The owner, Patricia Henley, had been planning weddings for 15 years and had the polished efficiency of someone who'd learned to manage both budgets and egos with equal skill. Kina arrived 20 minutes late, making an entrance that involved dramatic apologies about traffic and a detailed explanation of her morning spa appointment. Leora trailed behind her, looking increasingly uncomfortable as her mother commandeered the conversation before we'd even sat down. Patricia, darling, I hope you've had time to review the changes I sent over. The upgraded linens are absolutely essential. The original ones were far too basic for the kind of celebration we're planning. Patricia consulted her tablet with the patience of someone accustomed to difficult clients. Yes, I have the revised specifications. The upgraded package will add approximately $1,200 to the final bill. Perfect. And the additional floral arrangements for the entrance? Another $800. Wonderful. Oh, and we'll definitely need the premium bar package instead of the standard one. I can't have guests thinking we're cutting corners on hospitality. I watched this exchange with growing amazement. In 10 minutes, Kina had added over $3,000 to the wedding costs without consulting anyone else at the table. When Patricia turned to me with an expectant look, I understood that I was expected to simply nod and accept these decisions. Mrs. Torren, I said carefully, perhaps we should discuss these changes with Selias and Leora before finalizing anything. Kina waved her hand dismissively. Oh, they trust my judgment completely, don't you, dear? She didn't wait for Leora's response before continuing. Besides, this is really about the family's reputation. People will remember this wedding for years to come. Whose reputation exactly? I asked. The question seemed to catch her off guard. Well, everyone's naturally. The bride's family, the groom's family. We're all represented by how this event unfolds. I see. And who's responsible for ensuring that representation meets your standards? Patricia cleared her throat diplomatically. Perhaps we should review the current payment structure. The contract shows that all expenses are being covered by the groom's family, with final payment due 2 weeks before the ceremony. That's correct, Kina confirmed with satisfaction. Zane has been wonderfully generous about handling the financial aspects so that the children can focus on their happiness. I felt something click into place. Not anger, but a cold, clear understanding of exactly how this arrangement had been structured. Patricia, could I see a copy of that contract? Of course. She handed me a folder containing several pages of detailed specifications and payment schedules. I read through the document carefully while the others waited. Every line item, every deposit, every final payment was assigned to either Selias Braskin or Zane Braskin. The bride's family appeared nowhere in the financial obligations, despite having made most of the decisions about upgrades and additions. This is interesting, I said, setting the contract on the table. According to this, my son is personally responsible for over $40,000 in wedding expenses. Well, traditionally the groom's family handles the major costs, Kina said, though her voice had lost some of its confidence. Traditionally, the bride's family handles the wedding costs, I corrected. But let's set tradition aside. What I find fascinating is that someone has been making expensive decisions about an event that they have no financial responsibility for. The silence in the room was deafening. Patricia looked like she wanted to disappear. Leora was staring at her hands, and Kina's face had flushed red. I think you're misunderstanding the situation, Kina said finally. This is a collaborative effort. Everyone is contributing what they can. What exactly are you contributing, Kina? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Kina's mouth opened and closed twice before she found her voice. I'm contributing my experience, my connections, my time and energy to ensure this wedding is everything it should be. Your time and energy, I repeated, to spend my money. Now see here. No, you see here. I stood up, and something in my posture must have communicated that the polite portion of this conversation was over. You've been treating me like an ATM for months, making decisions, issuing demands, and expecting me to pay for your vision of what this wedding should be. But you've made one critical error. What's that? Kina's voice was barely above a whisper. You assumed I had no choice in the matter. I turned to Patricia, who was watching this exchange with the horrified fascination of someone witnessing a car accident. Patricia, what happens if the financially responsible party withdraws from this contract? She glanced nervously between me and Kina before answering. Well, the contract would be void. All deposits would be forfeited, and the event would be canceled unless alternative payment arrangements could be made immediately. And how much notice would you need to cancel without penalty to the venue? The contract specifies 2 weeks. Thank you. That's very helpful information. I sat back down and looked directly at Kana, whose face had gone from red to white in the space of 30 seconds. Here's what's going to happen, I said quietly. You're going to stop making unilateral decisions about expenses that you're not paying for. You're going to treat my son with respect instead of viewing him as a source of funding for your lifestyle fantasies. And you're going to remember that this wedding is supposed to be about Selias and Leora's happiness, not your social status. You can't threaten me? I'm not threatening you. I'm explaining reality. This entire event exists at my discretion. Every vendor, every deposit, every final payment depends on my continued cooperation. And that cooperation is not guaranteed. Kana turned to Leora with desperation in her eyes. Leora, tell him he can't do this. Tell him how important this wedding is to your future. Leora looked up for the first time since the conversation had begun, and I saw something in her expression that surprised me. Relief. Mom, maybe we should just keep things simple. The original plans were fine. Simple? Kina's voice rose to nearly a shriek. This is your wedding, not some backyard barbecue. This is supposed to be the most important day of your life. The most important part is marrying Selias, Leora said quietly. The rest is just details. I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe there was something genuine between my son and this young woman after all. Maybe the financial manipulation was all Kana's doing, and Leora was as much a victim as Selias. But Kana wasn't finished. She turned back to me with venom in her eyes. You think you're so clever, don't you? You think you can control everything with your money, but you're forgetting something important. What's that? Your son loves my daughter, and love makes people do stupid things. Even if you pull out now, he'll find a way to give her the wedding she deserves. He'll mortgage his future, take out loans, whatever it takes. Because that's what men do when they really love a woman. The words hit their target with surgical precision. Because she was right. Selias would bankrupt himself before disappointing Leora. His sense of honor and responsibility would compel him to find the money somehow, even if it meant destroying his financial future. You're probably right about that, I admitted. My son is loyal and generous to a fault, but you're making the same mistake you made before. What mistake? You're assuming that I'll let that happen. I stood up again and gathered my copy of the contract. Patricia, thank you for your time. I'll be in touch about our final decisions within the next few days. As I walked toward the door, Kina called after me. You can't stop this wedding. Selias won't let you. I paused at the threshold and looked back at her. You're right. I can't stop it, and I won't try. But I can make sure that if it happens for the right reasons. The drive home gave me time to think about what I'd learned. The contract made it clear that Selias was legally responsible for tens of thousands of dollars in wedding expenses. The pattern of financial requests was escalating rather than decreasing. And Kana's reaction to my questions revealed that she viewed my family as a resource to be exploited rather than people to be respected. But the most troubling realization was that Kana understood my son better than I'd given her credit for. She knew exactly which emotional buttons to push to keep the money flowing, and she was counting on his love for Leora to override his common sense. What she didn't understand was that I'd been planning for this possibility since the night of that first dinner. I'd been quiet, patient, and observant, while she grew increasingly bold and careless. And now I had all the leverage I needed. The question was whether I'd have the courage to use it when the moment came. That moment was coming sooner than I thought. The call came from Selias at 11:30 on a Thursday night, 3 weeks before the wedding. His voice was strained, exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. Dad, I need to see you. Can I come over? Of course. Are you all right? I'll be there in 20 minutes. He arrived looking like he'd aged 5 years in the past month. His usually neat appearance was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, his hair uncombed. When he slumped into my kitchen chair, I could see the weight of whatever he was carrying pressing down on his shoulders. Tell me what's happening, I said, setting a beer in front of him. He took a long drink before answering. I think I'm in over my head, Dad. The wedding costs keep climbing, and every time I think we've reached the limit, something else comes up. Kana says it's all necessary, that cutting corners will reflect poorly on everyone involved. How much are we talking about now? $63,000. The words came out like a confession. Maybe more, depending on final headcount and some last-minute additions Kina wants to make. I felt my chest tighten. $63,000 was more than many people earned in a year. It was more than the down payment on a house, more than a new car, more than a reasonable person would spend on a single day's celebration. Selias, that's an enormous amount of money. I know it is. But Kina keeps saying that this is a once-in-a-lifetime event, that we can't put a price on Leora's happiness. And when I try to push back, Leora gets upset and says I don't understand how important this is to her. What does Leora say when you discuss the costs with her privately? He was quiet for so long that I thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. We don't really discuss them privately. Kina is always there when wedding planning comes up. She says it's too stressful for Leora to handle the details, that it's better if the adults take care of the logistics. The adults, meaning you and Kina? Yeah. And what about Leora's contribution to these costs? Another long pause. She's contributing in other ways. Her time, her connections, her expertise about what works on social media. The wedding photos are going to be a huge boost for her blog. I felt that familiar cold sensation in my stomach. Selias, listen to what you just said. You're paying $63,000 for a wedding that's going to benefit Leora's business. Does that sound like a partnership to you? It's not that simple. It's exactly that simple. You're funding someone else's professional photo shoot and calling it your wedding. He set down his beer and looked at me with eyes that held a desperate kind of hope. Dad, what should I do? I can't back out now. The invitations have been sent, people have made travel plans, deposits have been paid, and if I disappoint Leora... What? What happens if you disappoint Leora? She'll leave me. The words came out in a rush, as if saying them quickly would make them hurt less. She's already hinted that if I'm not committed to making this wedding everything it should be, maybe we should reconsider the whole thing. There it was, the threat that had been hanging over his head all along. Marry me on my terms, or lose me forever. It was emotional blackmail disguised as romantic ultimatum, and my son was too close to the situation to see it clearly. Selias, if someone threatens to leave you because you can't afford their demands, what does that tell you about their feelings for you? It tells me that I need to find a way to afford their demands. The answer broke my heart because I could hear the echo of my own voice in it. I'd raised him to be responsible, to honor his commitments, to sacrifice for the people he loved, but I'd failed to teach him the difference between love and manipulation. Son, I want to show you something. I went to my home office and retrieved a folder I'd been compiling over the past several weeks. Inside were printouts of social media posts, screenshots of blog entries, and copies of various financial documents that Selias had shared with me during his requests for help. What's all this? He asked as I spread the papers across the kitchen table. Research. Look at these posts from Leora's Instagram account over the past 6 months. He leaned forward, studying the images. They showed Leora at expensive restaurants, wearing designer clothes, carrying luxury handbags, traveling to resorts that cost more per night than most people spent on vacations. Now look at the dates, I continued. Every single one of these posts corresponds to a period when you gave her money for business expenses or temporary cash flow problems. His face was pale as he processed the timeline. That doesn't necessarily mean anything. Maybe she was celebrating closing a big deal or meeting with potential partners. Maybe. Or maybe she was spending your money on lifestyle content for her blog while telling you she needed it for equipment and business development. I pulled out another set of documents. These are the financial records for Elevated Influence, the agency that's supposedly representing her. I had a friend who works in marketing research look into them. You investigated her agency? I investigated a company that my son was indirectly funding, and here's what I found. Elevated Influence is a shell company that exists primarily to collect fees from aspiring influencers who want representation. They provide minimal actual services and have placed fewer than a dozen clients in paid partnerships over the past 2 years. Selias stared at the documents as if they were written in a foreign language. But Leora said they were confident they could get her consistent work. I'm sure they were confident that she'd keep paying their monthly fees while they made vague promises about future opportunities. I watched my son's world reshape itself around this new information. The woman he loved, the future he'd been planning, the sacrifices he'd been making. All of it was built on a foundation of deception and manipulation. Dad, what am I supposed to do with this? The wedding is in 3 weeks. Everything is already arranged. You're supposed to make a decision based on truth instead of manipulation. You're supposed to ask yourself whether you want to marry someone who's been lying to you about her finances, her business prospects, and her reasons for needing your money. But I love her. I know you do. But love isn't enough if it's not reciprocated honestly. And based on everything I've seen, Leora and her mother view you as a source of funding first and a person second. We sat in silence for several minutes while Selias absorbed the implications of what I'd shown him. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. What if I confront her about this? What if I give her a chance to explain? What explanation could possibly justify this level of deception? Maybe she was embarrassed about her financial situation. Maybe she thought I wouldn't understand the pressures she was under to maintain her image for business purposes. I could see him grasping for reasons to excuse the inexcusable, and I understood the impulse. Accepting the truth meant accepting that he'd been played for a fool, that his generosity had been exploited, that his love had been weaponized against him. Selias, even if that were true, even if she had noble reasons for lying to you about money, do you really want to marry someone who thinks deception is an acceptable solution to financial problems? He didn't answer, but I could see the question working its way through his mind like a slow poison. Everything he'd believed about his relationship, everything he'd sacrificed to make Leora happy, everything he'd endured from Kana's entitled demands, all of it was being recontextualized by the evidence spread across my kitchen table. I need time to think, he said finally. You don't have much time. The wedding is in 3 weeks, and canceling now will forfeit every deposit you've paid. How much would I lose? I consulted the contract copies I'd obtained from Patricia. About $28,000 in non-refundable deposits and payments. He winced as if I'd slapped him. $28,000 just gone. Gone either way, I pointed out. The question is whether you want to lose $28,000 to escape a bad situation or lose $63,000 to make it permanent. As he left that night, I could see that something fundamental had shifted in his perspective. The doubt that had been growing for weeks was finally crystallizing into understanding. But understanding and action were different things, and I wasn't sure he had the strength to do what needed to be done. What I didn't anticipate was that Kina would force his hand sooner than either of us expected. The final confrontation was coming, and it would be more public and more devastating than anyone imagined. The rehearsal dinner was held at Riverside Country Club, the same venue that had been deemed insufficient for the actual wedding but apparently adequate for the pre-wedding festivities. I arrived to find the private dining room decorated with white linens and centerpieces that probably cost more than most people spent on their entire wedding flowers. Kina held court at the head table, wearing a dress that screamed expensive and jewelry that caught the light with every gesture. She'd clearly positioned herself as the evening's hostess, directing servers, adjusting place cards, and greeting guests as if she were the mother of the bride and the event coordinator rolled into one. Leora sat beside her in a pale pink dress that complemented her carefully styled hair and professionally applied makeup. She looked beautiful in the way that required significant time and money to achieve, but there was something brittle about her smile, something forced about her laughter that suggested the pressure was getting to her. Selias stood near the bar, accepting congratulations from friends and relatives with the enthusiasm of someone facing a root canal. Since our conversation 3 nights earlier, he'd been quiet and withdrawn, going through the motions of wedding preparation without any visible joy or excitement. I made my way through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries with cousins and family friends who'd traveled from across the country for the celebration. Everyone seemed genuinely happy for Selias, which made the situation even more painful. These people had no idea they were witnessing the prelude to a disaster. Zane! Kina's voice cut through the ambient conversation like a blade. There's the man of the hour. Come here. I want to introduce you to some people. I approached the head table with the resignation of someone walking toward their own reckoning. Kina immediately launched into a series of introductions that seemed designed more to showcase her connections than to facilitate actual conversation. This is Margaret Ashford. Her daughter is married to the Morrison pharmaceutical fortune I mentioned. And this is Charlie Reller. He owns 3 restaurants downtown. Everyone, this is Zane Braskin, Selias' father, and our wonderful benefactor for this entire celebration. Benefactor. As if I were some wealthy patron supporting the arts rather than a father paying for his son's wedding. The introduction made it clear that my primary value in Kenya's eyes was financial, and she wanted everyone to understand the hierarchy she'd established. Lovely to meet you, Margaret said with the polished warmth of someone accustomed to charity galas and country club events. Kena tells me you own several auto repair shops. How entrepreneurial. The word entrepreneurial was delivered with a kind of tone usually reserved for discussing quaint hobbies rather than serious businesses. I smiled politely and nodded, understanding that I was being categorized as new money, acceptable for funding purposes but not quite socially equivalent to the pharmaceutical and restaurant fortunes at the table. As dinner progressed, I watched Kena work the room with the skill of a professional networker. She made sure everyone knew about the upgraded venue for tomorrow's ceremony, the exclusive photographer who'd shot several celebrity weddings, the designer who'd created Leora's custom dress. Every detail was presented as evidence of the family's sophistication and resources. What she didn't mention was who was actually paying for these upgrades and exclusives. The toasts began after the main course, starting with Leora's father, a quiet man who'd been largely absent from the wedding planning process. His speech was brief and generic, touching on themes of love and commitment without any personal anecdotes or specific references to Selias. It was the kind of toast someone gives when they don't really know the groom well enough to say anything meaningful about him. Several of Selias's friends spoke next, sharing stories from college and work that painted a picture of a loyal, hard-working, generous young man. Their affection for him was genuine and obvious, which made Kana's subsequent behavior even more jarring. When she stood to give her toast, Kana commanded the room's attention with the presence of someone accustomed to being the center of focus. She raised her wine glass, a vintage that probably cost more than most bottles, and smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd achieved exactly what she'd set out to accomplish. "I want to thank everyone for being here tonight to celebrate Leora and Selias," she began, her voice carrying easily across the room. "This has been such a wonderful journey, watching these two young people find each other and build something beautiful together." She paused for effect, letting her gaze sweep across the assembled guests before continuing. "Of course, building something beautiful requires the right foundation. It requires family support, financial stability, and practical planning for the future. Some people think romance is enough, but those of us with experience know better." I felt my chest tighten as I recognized the direction this speech was heading. "Selias is a lovely young man," Kina continued, "and I'm sure he means well, but let's be honest. He thinks this is love." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Around the room, guests shifted uncomfortably as they processed what they'd just heard. The bride's mother had just publicly dismissed the groom's feelings as naive delusion. Kina seemed oblivious to the shocked silence that had fallen over the room. She continued speaking as if she'd made a charming observation rather than delivered a devastating insult. "Fortunately, Leora is much more practical about these things. She understands that successful marriages require more than feelings. They require planning, resources, and family support. And thanks to Zane's generosity, they'll have everything they need to start their life together properly." She raised her glass higher, apparently expecting the room to join her in a toast to my financial contribution rather than the couple's happiness. A few people reluctantly lifted their glasses, but the enthusiasm that had characterized earlier toasts was notably absent. I looked across the room at Selias, who was staring at Kana with an expression of pure horror. This was the woman who would be his mother-in-law, the person who would be part of his family for the rest of his life. And she'd just publicly announced that she considered his love for her daughter to be nothing more than a useful illusion. Leora was frantically whispering something in her mother's ear, clearly trying to get her to sit down and stop talking. But Kana was on a roll, emboldened by wine and the satisfaction of having successfully maneuvered everyone into position for tomorrow's expensive celebration. "So, here's to practical love," she concluded with a laugh that sounded like breaking glass. "The kind that comes with a solid foundation and a bright financial future." The toast was met with scattered applause and uncomfortable murmurs. People began turning back to their conversations, but the damage was done. Everyone in that room now understood exactly what Kina thought about the marriage they'd come to celebrate. As the evening wound down, I found myself standing near the exit, watching guests filter out into the parking lot. Many of them looked confused and uncomfortable, as if they'd witnessed something inappropriate but weren't quite sure what to do about it. Selias approached me as I was preparing to leave, his face pale and his hands shaking slightly. "Dad, did you hear what she said?" "I heard. She thinks I'm a fool. She thinks I'm just some naive kid who doesn't understand what real love looks like." "What do you think, Selias?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the parking lot where guests were getting into cars that probably cost more than his annual salary. "I think she's been playing me from the beginning," he said finally. "I think they both have." "And what are you going to do about that?" He turned to look at me, and for the first time in weeks, I saw clarity in his eyes instead of confusion. "I'm going to find out tomorrow, at the wedding, in front of everyone." As I drove home through the quiet suburban streets, I realized that the moment of truth was finally approaching. Tomorrow, my son would have to choose between the comfortable lie he'd been living and the painful truth he'd finally recognized. And I would have to decide how far I was willing to go to support him in that choice. The wedding was in 18 hours, and everything was about to change. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright, with the kind of perfect weather that photographers love and nervous fathers dread. I stood in my bedroom, adjusting my tie in the mirror, and wondered if I was about to make the biggest mistake of my life or prevent my son from making his. The Fairmont Grand Ballroom was a study in expensive elegance, with crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a stunning view of downtown Chicago. The floral arrangements alone probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments, and every detail spoke of money spent without concern for practical limits. I arrived early, ostensibly to check on last-minute arrangements, but really to observe the final preparations and steel myself for what was coming. Kana was already there, directing vendors with the authority of a military commander, her voice carrying across the ballroom as she issued instructions and corrections. "The centerpieces need to be rotated 15 degrees clockwise," she called to a harried-looking florist. "And make sure the lighting technician understands that we need warm tones for the photos, not those harsh white spots." She wore a dress that probably cost more than most wedding gowns, with jewelry that caught the light like armor. This was her moment of triumph, the culmination of months of planning and manipulation. She'd successfully orchestrated an expensive celebration funded entirely by someone else's money, and she was savoring every detail. Leora stood near the bridal suite entrance, looking stunning in a custom gown that had required 3 fittings and countless alterations. Her hair and makeup were flawless, her smile perfectly practiced for the photographer who was already capturing candid moments for her social media portfolio. But when I looked closely, I could see the strain around her eyes, the tension in her shoulders. She kept glancing toward the groom's preparation area with an expression that might have been anxiety or guilt or both. Selias was getting dressed in a private room adjacent to the ballroom, surrounded by his groomsmen and the nervous energy that always accompanies major life events. When I knocked and entered, I found him standing before a mirror, struggling with his bow tie. "Let me help with that," I offered, stepping forward to adjust the silk. "Thanks, Dad." His voice was quiet, thoughtful. "I've been thinking about what you said, about truth and consequences and making decisions based on reality instead of hope. And what have you concluded? I've concluded that I deserve better than someone who views me as a financial opportunity. I deserve someone who loves me for who I am, not what I can provide." I finished adjusting his tie and stepped back to look at my son. He was 27 years old, handsome, intelligent, and kind. He had his whole life ahead of him, and he was finally ready to claim it on his own terms. "What do you want to do?" I asked. "I want to end this, but I want to do it right. I want everyone to understand why." The ceremony was scheduled to begin at 4 o'clock. At 3:30, guests began filing into the ballroom, taking their seats in chairs decorated with white ribbon and small bouquets of flowers that probably cost $50 each. The photographer moved through the crowd, capturing moments of anticipation and joy that would soon be replaced by shock and confusion. At 3:45, the wedding party took their positions. Selias stood at the altar with his groomsmen, looking calm and resolved in a way that surprised me. He'd found his center, his sense of purpose, and nothing was going to shake his determination to do what needed to be done. The music began, and Leora appeared at the back of the ballroom, radiant in her designer gown and surrounded by bridesmaids in coordinated dresses. She walked down the aisle with practiced grace, smiling for the cameras and the assembled guests who had no idea they were about to witness something unprecedented. When she reached the altar, the officiant began the traditional ceremony, speaking about love and commitment and the sacred bond of marriage. The words felt hollow in the context of what everyone in the room knew about the financial arrangements that had made this moment possible. "Do you, Selias James Braskin, take Leora Michelle Torren to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" Selias looked at Leora for a long moment, and I could see her growing confusion as she realized something was wrong. This wasn't the look of a man about to pledge his eternal love. This was the look of someone who'd finally seen through a beautiful illusion. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent ballroom, "but I can't." The words hit the assembled guests like a physical blow. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd as people processed what they'd just heard. The groom had just refused to marry the bride at the altar in front of 200 witnesses. "Selias, what are you doing?" Leora's voice was barely above a whisper, but the microphone system carried it to every corner of the room. "I'm choosing honesty over deception," he replied. "I'm choosing self-respect over manipulation. I'm choosing to walk away from someone who never loved me for who I am." Kina rose from her seat in the front row, her face flushed with fury and embarrassment. "You can't do this. Everything is paid for. Everyone is here. You can't humiliate my daughter like this." "Your daughter humiliated herself," Selias said calmly. "By lying about her business, by taking my money under false pretenses, and by allowing you to treat me like a walking ATM instead of a human being." The ballroom was completely silent now, except for the sound of phones recording what was quickly becoming the most dramatic wedding disaster anyone had ever witnessed. Social media was about to explode with videos of the bride being left at the altar by a groom who'd finally had enough. "Leora," Selias continued, turning back to his intended bride, I hope someday you find someone who makes you genuinely happy. But that person isn't me, and I'm not going to bankrupt myself trying to become him." He stepped down from the altar and walked toward the exit, his groomsmen following in stunned silence. As he passed my row, he paused and looked at me. "Dad, are you coming?" I stood up, straightened my jacket, and joined my son. Together, we walked out of the ballroom while 200 guests sat in shocked silence behind us. In the corridor outside, Selias finally allowed his composure to crack. He leaned against the wall and took several deep breaths, the weight of what he'd just done settling on his shoulders. "I can't believe I actually did that," he said. "I'm proud of you," I replied. "It took courage to choose truth over comfort. What happens now? Now you start over. You build a life based on honesty instead of manipulation. You find someone who loves you for who you are, not what you can provide." Behind us, we could hear the chaos erupting in the ballroom. Raised voices, crying, the sound of chairs scraping against marble floors as guests began to leave. The expensive celebration that Kana had orchestrated so carefully was collapsing into social disaster. As we walked toward the parking garage, I pulled out my phone and called Patricia at Elegant Events. "Patricia, this is Zane Braskin. I'm sure you've heard by now that the wedding has been called off. Please ensure that all vendors are paid for their work today, but any future obligations under the contract are void as of this moment." "Of course, Mr. Braskin. I'm so sorry about how things turned out." "Don't be sorry. Sometimes things turn out exactly the way they're supposed to." We drove home in comfortable silence, two men who'd finally learned the difference between love and transaction, between family and exploitation, between generosity and being played for fools. The next morning, social media was buzzing with videos and photos from the wedding that wasn't. Left at the altar was trending, along with speculation about what had caused such a dramatic public rejection. But Selias wasn't reading social media. He was sitting at my kitchen table, drinking coffee and planning his future. A future based on honesty, self-respect, and the understanding that real love doesn't come with a price tag. 6 months later, he met Sky, a teacher who drove a 10-year-old Honda and thought expensive restaurants were a waste of money. Their first date cost $12 and included the best conversation he'd ever had with a woman. When they got married 2 years later, the ceremony cost less than the flowers at Leora's planned wedding. But it was filled with genuine joy, honest love, and the kind of happiness that money can't buy. As for Kana and Leora, they disappeared from our lives as quickly as they'd entered them. The last I heard, Leora was engaged to a real estate developer who apparently appreciated her business acumen more than Selias had. I never did find out if she learned anything from the experience, but it didn't matter. Some people are determined to repeat their mistakes until they find someone willing to fund them. Selias wasn't that someone, and neither was I. Standing in that ballroom, watching my son choose self-respect over social pressure, I realized that sometimes the most loving thing a father can do is teach his child when to walk away. The wedding that was supposed to cost $63,000 ended up costing exactly what it was worth. Nothing. And that was the most valuable lesson of all.